Hello, I'm diving straight into it today. For today's video, I decided I really wanted to paint on some black watercolor paper. And I'd seen this lovely photo of an owl. I can't remember if it was on Pixabay or another free picture website called Unsplash. If I can find it, I will reference it down in the description below. I actually changed mine into black and white, I think, using Photoshop. The black paper I am using is by a brand called Etival. It's their Aquarel paper, 300 GSM, but it is 100% cellulose. There is no cotton in this one. I was looking at, I think it was the Stonehenge one which had cotton in, but at the time it was really expensive, and so I ended up getting this one. It's actually pretty good, and it held a lot of water, although it did start to buckle after a while. But that's also because I didn't tape it down, as is my usual way. Also because I really didn't want the tape to rip the paper, because I figured it would be quite noticeable on here. The pad of paper I have is an A3 size, and I just cut this down into a squarer version. I took off one edge just because it was too much of the black paper, and I didn't really want to have to paint a background on this. And the paint I am using is Daniel Smith's Titanium White Watercolor. Now, white watercolor is something I've been bagging on quite a bit lately because usually it's just not very opaque at all, but this one's actually pretty good and is one of the more opaque versions I've tried. Though you can see here it is drying a lot more translucent than when I first paint it down, and that is the problem with white watercolor that I've always found, is that when you lay it down it looks really white and bright to begin with, but then once it dries it goes this kind of milky color, and so I can see why a lot of people just really don't like white watercolor, and for the most part I don't find it that useful, but I did enjoy using it for this, and you'll see a little while later that I did actually build up the layers a little bit. Now I could have gone in with some white gouache with this, but I just wanted to try the watercolor and to see how much opacity I could achieve from the paint. It's pretty good. But unless you're using it straight from the tube, as soon as you add that water in, it really does start to dilute it down into more transparent layers. I kind of like this effect on the black. It works well for creating a mid-tone, which is what I was doing at the moment. I was adding in as much white as possible to most of the owl because a lot of the owl has those grey mid-tone ranges as well as the really bright whites and the dark blacks. And before I forget, I actually drew this out using a white watercolor pencil so that when I paint over it with water, it will then blend out into the watercolor paint. And that's a really good trick to use if you don't want to see any pencil marks on your painting. Use water-soluble pencils. So you could see, once this paper fully dried, that white watercolor has gone a very translucent grey because the black paper is showing through underneath. But now I had that underpainting, I was then able to go over it with a much thicker layer of white watercolor paint using minimal water and get in some of those feathery details over the top. So the underlayer is still showing through in parts, which gives it the mid-tone effect, and then I get the brighter highlights over the top of that. I did lose, annoyingly, some of the black that I wanted to keep in the feathers, but you'll see I fixed that up a little bit, especially around the eyes and beak a bit later. So I wanted to get detail into this owl, but I don't want it to be so detailed that I have every single feather in there. It's more of a stylized version, which is how I tend to paint anyway. I much prefer to have the impression of detail so you can still see what it is, but it's not that hyper-realistic detail, which I think is really amazing, but it really does take forever to do, and I don't have that kind of patience. Plus, I also prefer mine to not look exactly like a photograph. I want it to look more like an actual painting and have that artsy sort of feel to it rather than just being exactly the same as the reference photo. That's my own preference. I know everyone's going to have a different taste when it comes to that sort of thing. And that's the beauty of art. You can make it your own and paint it however you like with as much or as little detail as you want. So I'm not sure if you can see it yet, but even this top layer of much thicker watercolor started to dry quite transparently again. although not as much as the lower layer, and it was going to require quite a few more layers, I think, to get it really bright, although I think, to be honest, there is quite a limit when it comes to white watercolor, that it is only going to go so bright before it will just not take any more. And you will see in a while what I did to get some really bright highlights on this painting. But overall, I painted this owl pretty quickly. I did the first layer on one day and I let it dry overnight just because I had a few other things to do. And then I came back and pretty much finished the entire thing, that whole top layer, in one sitting. Took me a couple of hours, I guess. I don't know, I was just kind of in a mood to do a painting and not really have to focus on doing art supply reviews or anything. Sometimes I just like to use the actual art supplies and make art rather than worrying about going into huge details of the art supplies themselves. I mean, you know I love collecting art supplies and trying out new things, but there are times when I just feel like sitting down and painting something or drawing a picture and not really worrying about what I'm using, just more that I am creating something out of nothing. In this case, a blank piece of black paper, which is not something I do very often, so this was quite a learning experience for me and I had a lot of fun with it, which is what it's all about. Now I'd got the top layer of the watercolor down, it really needed a bit of refining, so I'm just using a black pen here to cover parts that I'd accidentally painted over and get those nice neat black areas around the beak and the eyes, and this really lifted it. And then those bright highlights, I used a white gel pen because nothing beats the opacity of one of those. They're fantastic. And here's the finished piece. I think I was pretty successful working up from dark to light with the black as the darkest shadow, and then I've added in lighter layers of white watercolor for midtones, going into thicker layers for those brighter highlights, and then using that white gel pen for those really super bright white highlights. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I hope you enjoyed this video. It wasn't really meant to be anything in particular, I just felt like painting, and I just thought I would bring you along with the process. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you all again really soon in my next video. Swatch you later. Bye!